Simon Harding never intended to draw attention to himself. He wasn't the type to ruffle feathers or seek recognition beyond his circle. By the time he moved into his new home just outside the capital, he had already spent 27 years climbing through the dense, competitive ranks of the judicial system, and now served as one of the senior clerks at the United States Supreme Court. He wasn't the youngest, wasn't the flashiest, but those who mattered knew his name, and more importantly, respected it. He was deliberate in his actions, precise in his speech, and meticulous about privacy. It wasn't out of paranoia, but necessity. When you've seen how quickly legal structures can be twisted to ruin someone's life, you learn to play very, very carefully. His new house was not in some lavish, gated community or high-security estate. It was in a quiet, well-maintained suburban area with broad sidewalks, low fences, and carefully manicured yards. Comfortable, but not ostentatious. The kind of neighborhood where people smiled politely, waved without making eye contact, and silently judged the quality of your landscaping. It suited Simon perfectly. It had taken months of searching to find a place that met all his criteria: decent land boundaries, solid construction, no shared driveways, no known disputes on the record, and, crucially, a detached storage building he could legally convert into a climate-controlled garage for his motorcycles. The bikes weren't just a hobby. They were a small act of defiance, a living piece of his youth that he refused to part with. Restoring vintage motorcycles was the one thing that disconnected him from statutes, arguments, and politics. They didn't talk back. They didn't demand decisions. They just waited. The most prized machine in his collection was a 1952 Vincent Black Shadow, rebuilt bolt by bolt, polished until the engine casing gleamed like obsidian. It stayed in the garage undercover, away from sunlight and idle curiosity. But Simon also had a 1980 BMW R80 GS, fully functional, which he used to ride on weekends. It wasn't flashy or loud, just clean, dependable, and classically beautiful. He'd parked it temporarily on the far side of his driveway on a Saturday afternoon, after a short ride into the hills, intending to reorganize the garage before bringing it in. It was neatly parked off the street, angled in a way that didn't obstruct anyone's path. To anyone else, it would have seemed inconsequential. To Simon, it was routine. 2 days later, he found the envelope. Thick, cream-colored, sealed with a printed label that read, "Community Compliance Notice." It was tucked awkwardly into his mailbox, slightly creased with no stamp. The tone inside was formal but unmistakably aggressive, citing unauthorized vehicle placement and repeated violations of aesthetic code, accompanied by a printed photo of his motorcycle taken from the sidewalk. The note concluded with a demand for immediate relocation of the vehicle and payment of an initial $2,000 fine. No warning, no prior notice, and more concerning than anything else, the accusation of repetition. He had never received a single complaint before this. Simon didn't panic. Instead, he did what he always did. He documented. He took photos of the location, reviewed the association's publicly available bylaws, made digital copies of every related communication, and stored them in a new file marked Dispute. He also placed a polite call to the association office, expecting perhaps a miscommunication, a clerical mistake. What he got instead was Karen. The voice on the other end was bright but brittle, speaking with the kind of artificial concern that immediately grated. She identified herself as the president of the community board and confirmed the violation with a kind of smug finality. "We've received multiple concerns," she said, "and we do need everyone to follow the same rules. Motorcycles can create a certain impression." Simon asked what rule had been violated, and she hesitated just a breath too long before referencing a clause about unapproved outdoor storage units. When he clarified that this was a vehicle, not a unit, and parked on his own private driveway, she pivoted. "Well, it's also about consistent aesthetics. We can't have machinery cluttering up the curb appeal. This is a residential community, Mr. Harding, not a repair shop." He thanked her, ended the call, and went back to the documents. Nowhere in the covenants or addendums was there any language about motorcycles being banned, nor anything defining outdoor vehicle parking as a violation. The only reference remotely close was a rule against inoperable or visibly damaged vehicles left for extended periods. His BMW was neither. He prepared a response and submitted it formally through both email and certified mail, citing the governing rules and politely requesting a withdrawal of the fine. He expected resistance. What he didn't expect was escalation. Less than 2 weeks later, a letter arrived via registered courier. Inside, a formal lawsuit filed against him by the community association, seeking damages of $270,000 for flagrant and sustained noncompliance, willful disregard for community regulations, and infliction of reputational harm on the neighborhood. The accompanying packet included photo documentation taken from multiple angles, a half-dozen written complaints, anonymous, naturally, and a page listing various obscure code references that seemed cherry-picked and deliberately misapplied. Simon was stunned, not just by the amount, but by the sudden shift in tone. This wasn't just pressure. This was a coordinated strike. He sat for a long time at the kitchen table, reading through each document, weighing his options. He had been through enough legal battles in his career to recognize when something was being used not for justice, but for leverage. This wasn't about a bike. This was about ownership, or power, or something else entirely. Someone had gone out of their way to craft a case around a fiction, and that meant they were playing for something bigger. Maybe the land, maybe the garage. Maybe they just didn't like someone in their midst who didn't nod and wave at meetings. Whatever the reason, Simon knew one thing. The worst mistake he could make was underestimating the situation. So he made one quiet call. Not to a friend, not to a colleague, but to a seasoned civil defense attorney whose firm specialized in property law and community disputes. He didn't ask for favors. He paid the retainer upfront and sent the documents over within the hour. By nightfall, the attorney had replied with one sentence. "This is serious, but you're not alone. We'll handle it." Simon closed the file, powered down his computer, and stepped outside to the porch. The street was quiet, windows dim, the air cool with spring chill. Somewhere behind those drawn curtains, someone was planning to force his hand, but they didn't know who he was. And they didn't understand that Simon Harding never rolled over. Not for money, not for convenience. And definitely not for someone like Karen. The morning of Simon's preliminary hearing began not with nerves, but with a peculiar calm, the kind that only someone used to the rhythms of judicial combat could feel. He shaved, dressed deliberately in a charcoal suit, not flashy but deliberate, and checked the box containing his documentation for the third time before walking out the door. His attorney, Leonard Greer, a measured man in his late 50s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for methodical takedowns, had instructed Simon to remain silent unless directly addressed. This wasn't a trial yet, but Greer made it clear. Appearances matter, especially when you're up against people who don't expect you to fight back. The courthouse was modest, a municipal building that doubled as a zoning office and record center, and smelled faintly of dust and lemon cleaner. Inside in the small, overheated chamber where community hearings were held, Simon sat opposite Karen and her attorney, a man who looked far too slick for a simple neighborhood issue. He had the polished, bored confidence of someone billing $700 an hour to litigate parking disputes in Fence Heights. Karen, for her part, was dressed like she was auditioning to run a charity gala. A navy blue pantsuit stretched slightly too tight across her frame. Oversized pearls nestled against a neck that had seen too many tanning beds and not enough water. She didn't look at Simon. She didn't have to. The moment she sat down, she leaned toward her lawyer, whispering something that made him smile. The magistrate entered, gave a brief nod to both sides, and began the session by reading the case summary aloud. As the words left his mouth, egregious pattern of non-compliance, demonstrable contempt for community ordinances, persistent aesthetic violations resulting in harm to collective property values. Simon found himself momentarily stunned by the absurdity. This language didn't belong in a dispute over a parked motorcycle. It sounded like it had been crafted to vilify, not resolve. And that was when it truly clicked. This wasn't just bureaucracy gone mad. This was personal. Greer leaned toward Simon and murmured, "They're not playing for small stakes. She wants blood." The session continued, with Karen's lawyer presenting statements from neighbors, some real, others clearly invented, complaining about engine noises, oil stains that had never existed, even claims of suspicious visitors seen, lurking near Simon's property. The entire line of attack had been built on perception, fear, and repetition. banking on the idea that if enough smoke was conjured, people would believe there was fire. And while Greer countered with cool logic, photos, and carefully referenced bylaws that contradicted every claim, Simon knew this was just the opening act. This wasn't about right or wrong. It was about exhaustion, wearing him down until it became easier to give up than to keep going. After the hearing adjourned, no decisions made yet, only more paperwork and deadlines, Greer pulled Simon aside in the hallway. "You're looking at a multi-front siege. These kinds of tactics are designed to drain time, money, and will. She's got resources. We'll need to match her firepower with procedure." Greer handed Simon a list. "We start by filing formal requests for board meeting minutes, voting records, financial disclosures, anything we can to slow her down and push for transparency. Meanwhile, I want you to do nothing. No statements, no confrontation, not even casual hellos. Let her be the one who overreaches." Simon nodded, not because he needed direction, but because he appreciated clarity. He returned home to find 3 more notices tacked to his gate. One about the height of his hedge, another claiming his mailbox was non-standard, and the third accusing him of violating light pollution limits due to a motion sensor in his backyard. It would have been laughable if it weren't so strategic. Each infraction was trivial on its own, but together they created a paper trail, a narrative of someone constantly in violation, a liability to the community's order and image. It wasn't enforcement, it was harassment dressed in legal language. That evening, Simon cataloged the notices, scanned them, and sent them to Greer's office. He opened a fresh bottle of rye whiskey, poured 2 fingers into a tumbler, and sat on his back deck in the cool dusk. The air was still. Birds chirped in the trees. The world, to an outside observer, would have looked calm. But behind the curtains of every home facing his property, he imagined whispers, raised eyebrows, and judgment passed without trial. Karen wasn't just waging a legal battle. She was mounting a campaign of isolation, banking on peer pressure to break his resolve. 2 days later, Greer called with an update, his voice more cautious than usual. "We dug into the complaint history. Half those letters she submitted weren't properly filed. Some were backdated, and at least one comes from a resident who moved out last year. That helps us. But there's something else. You need to know she's working with a private land use consulting group. They've got ties to a developer trying to repurpose several parcels in your area, including the wooded strip that borders your rear fence line." Simon felt the slow tightening in his chest that only came with betrayal masked as protocol. "So, this was never about the motorcycle," he said, though he already knew. "No," Greer confirmed. "It's about access. That garage of yours? It sits on the one stretch of land that blocks a potential through road to a larger development. Your property is the cork in their bottle, and she's trying to pop it." Simon closed his eyes for a moment, letting the silence settle in. He'd dealt with power plays before, both subtle and brutal. But this was something different. This was the first time someone had tried to come through his personal walls, to undermine his autonomy, not with argument, but with relentless legal erosion. "What's our move next?" he asked. "We press harder," Greer replied. "We file a motion to compel discovery on her communication with third-party contractors and consultants. If she's abusing board powers for private gain, that's grounds for injunctive relief. And while we're at it, I want a full audit of the association's last 6 months of expenditures. If she's funneling money into outside consulting services, it won't look good." Simon agreed and hung up. That night, he didn't go into the garage, didn't start up the BMW, or touch the Vincent. He simply stood by the back gate, staring into the woods that had once given him peace and now felt like territory marked for invasion. Somewhere in those trees, plans were being made, not in the dark, but in boardrooms and email chains, under the guise of improvement and community betterment. They didn't care about the truth. They cared about access, profit, and silence. What they didn't realize, what Karen would learn far too late, was that Simon Harding didn't bend, didn't rattle, and didn't forget. Especially not when someone mistook his restraint for weakness. The catalyst had been lit, and now the game would begin in earnest. The days that followed the initial hearing unfolded with the kind of methodical dread that Simon Harding had only seen in constitutional cases, where one side knew it had lost the moral argument, but continued to batter the system with procedural weapons. It didn't matter that Greer was gaining ground legally. What Karen and her allies had initiated was no longer simply a dispute. It was a siege designed to grind away at Simon's stability, one inconvenience at a time, until he either folded or lashed out in a way that could be used against him. Every move was calculated to provoke, but none so overt that it would trigger immediate legal reprisal. It started with the lawn notices. 3 separate letters arrived on consecutive mornings from the board, each one addressing a different deficiency. One claimed the edges of his property line exhibited encroaching weed behavior that had not been appropriately mitigated. The next demanded uniformity of edging in line with neighborhood expectations. The third included a poorly photocopied diagram of an unidentified shrub that was allegedly non-conforming with approved plant aesthetics. Simon, who had hired a licensed landscaping company to maintain the property, scanned the notices, logged them, and forwarded them to Greer without a word of complaint. His only reaction was to quietly cancel his current lawn service and hire a new one with legal certification in municipal landscaping compliance. It cost twice as much, but left no room for interpretation. The visual results were, predictably, identical. But that wasn't the point. The point was documentation. He would make himself unassailable. One receipt, one timestamp, one registered delivery at a time. Then came the letters to his neighbors. They weren't sent directly to him, which made them harder to counter. Instead, 2 residents casually mentioned having received anonymous flyers in their mailboxes, warning about a resident in litigation with the community board, and urging vigilance regarding individuals whose behavior may not align with the values of our neighborhood. Simon didn't need to see the flyers to know they were about him. He also didn't need confirmation that Karen's fingerprints were all over the wording. It was her style, threatening through suggestion, accusatory through implication. She didn't need to say his name. The timing and context made it obvious. Still, he took no retaliatory steps. Instead, he reached out to Greer, who responded by issuing a cease and desist letter to the board, copied to the county commissioner's office and local media outlets. Not for publication, but for the record. Every whisper campaign left a trail eventually. On the legal front, Greer filed a discovery motion targeting the board's recent financial activity. Within the week, Simon received a copy of an emergency meeting agenda that had allegedly taken place 2 months prior. It bore a handful of signatures, none legible, all marked in different inks, and referenced the approval of funds for external consulting on community access optimization. Greer flagged it immediately. "This is the wedge," he told Simon. "If they used community dues to hire a firm with a vested interest in that development project and failed to disclose that to the homeowners, we've got them on procedural fraud." But that process would take time. Weeks, possibly months. In the meantime, the board escalated its harassment. A sudden inspection notice appeared on Simon's front door requesting immediate access to assess potential violations of fire safety ordinances in his detached garage. Simon refused entry, as was his right, and instead requested an explanation in writing, which, of course, never came. Days later, a new letter arrived, stating that his property had been reported for visible flammable material storage. This time it included a photo of a gas can, likely his backup motorcycle fuel container, taken through the hedge line without his permission, clearly shot from a concealed angle. That detail disturbed him more than the letter itself. Someone had entered his yard or leaned into his property line with a camera. That night, he installed 2 new motion-sensitive cameras at the edge of his lot, mounted low and discreet. The next morning, one of them captured a slow-moving figure in a bulky coat, pushing a stroller up the sidewalk. As the stroller paused, the figure stepped to the side and aimed what appeared to be a phone lens toward his fence. The figure? Karen, of course. She was attempting to provoke, baiting him to react. Simon didn't give her the satisfaction. He logged the footage, time-stamped the event, and sent it to Greer, who filed it with a formal notice of privacy violation and included a request for sanctions based on misuse of board authority to surveil residents. While the paperwork moved through its slow crawl, Karen shifted tactics. She sent a registered letter to Simon's homeowner insurance provider, expressing concerns over combustible storage and unauthorized structure use on his property, CC'd to the state fire marshal's office. The letter was carefully worded, just vague enough to pass as a request for inquiry rather than an accusation, but the damage was done. His insurance provider froze his coverage renewal process and flagged his account for mandatory inspection before the next policy period. Greer was livid. She's using administrative harassment. It's legal terrorism, and the worst part is, it works. Unless you make them pay for every shot they take. Simon adjusted accordingly. He contacted a private inspector pre-approved by his insurer, scheduled the visit on his terms, passed with no violations, and used the clean report to both reinstate his policy and initiate a formal complaint to the insurance commissioner regarding frivolous reporting. The commissioner's office acknowledged the filing and assigned a case number, which was a small victory but another step in the marathon. Karen wasn't working alone. That became obvious when a new series of letters began appearing, this time signed not by her, but by two junior board members claiming independent concern over property boundary inconsistencies. Simon saw the play immediately. She was laundering accusations through proxies to create the illusion of community consensus. The next board meeting was scheduled for Thursday night, and for the first time, Simon planned to attend. Not to confront, not to debate, but to listen. He arrived 5 minutes early, signed in quietly, and took a seat in the back. Karen spotted him immediately, her expression tightening just slightly before she smoothed it back into her usual smirk. The meeting followed a predictable script until they reached community concerns. One of the junior board members stood and cited recent issues with vehicle maintenance equipment and hazardous storage. Another spoke of concerns about non-conforming usage of detached structures. It was clearly orchestrated, a staged performance for the record. Then from the back row, another voice spoke. A tall man in his 70s, clean-cut and with a gravelly tone, raised his hand and said, "I've lived here 22 years, and that man," he nodded toward Simon, "has kept his place cleaner than half the people in this room. You don't like his bike? That's your taste. Don't dress it up as a fire hazard." The room shifted, unease rippling through the rows. Karen tried to regain control, but the air had changed. Simon didn't smile, didn't speak. He nodded once to the man, then quietly exited. He didn't need allies, but the gesture mattered. It meant not everyone was willing to be bullied into silence. The next morning, his mailbox contained another registered letter, this one notifying him of a second lawsuit filed by the board. This time, the charge was intentional infliction of distress upon governing bodies through obstruction, legal aggression, and refusal to cooperate with conflict resolution procedures. It was laughable on its face, a punishment for defending himself, but it was also dangerous. Now he faced a two-pronged legal assault designed to drain resources and time. Simon forwarded the documents to Greer and included a single line in the email. "This ends when they bleed out legally or when they misstep. Either way, I'm not moving." Greer's reply came quickly. "Then we keep tightening the net." The first escalation wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was slow, procedural, relentless. And Simon knew that was exactly how real power crushed people. Quietly through repetition, until resistance seemed more costly than defeat. But they'd made one mistake. They picked a man who had spent his entire life learning how to navigate that kind of system, and now they were about to find out what happened when their own weapons were turned against them. By the time the second lawsuit was officially on the docket, Simon understood that this was not simply a neighborhood dispute over rules and regulations. It was a coordinated and deeply layered campaign of attrition. The goal was no longer just to punish or displace him, but to establish dominance over the entire process of living within that community. What Karen and her silent allies were attempting was a quiet rewrite of the neighborhood's power structure, using him as the sacrificial precedent. They wanted a public loss that could be turned into doctrine, something they could point to when the next homeowner hesitated to comply with their whims. And Simon knew that if he didn't stop them here, they would replicate the same template again and again. What they hadn't accounted for was that their chosen target was someone who not only understood the judicial process, but had long ago learned how to weaponize structure, patience, and precision against those who assumed bureaucracy was their private playground. Greer had been working steadily in the background, layering one formal request over another, pushing for transparency and using their own paper trail to build a scaffolding for counterattack. The early complaints, mostly rooted in falsified reports and procedural overreach, had begun to unravel under scrutiny. Several of the anonymous neighbor statements were traced back to one of Karen's former associates, who had been paid as a consultant for community affairs, a title invented without authorization and retroactively inserted into board meeting records. That alone was enough to launch a formal ethics inquiry, and Greer filed the paperwork without hesitation. Simultaneously, their motion for a financial audit had hit a nerve. The board, once smug and dismissive, had grown visibly tense. Responses were delayed, meeting times rescheduled, documents returned with redactions and missing pages. Greer wasn't surprised. He had seen this dance before, and every obfuscation was another thread to tug. Then came the call from a contact inside the county land use office. A quiet voice who had reviewed Greer's filing and recognized the pattern from previous complaints. The voice didn't give a name, but it confirmed something they had suspected all along. The consultant firm working with Karen and her board had submitted preliminary zoning inquiries for a proposed road extension that would cut directly through the Ida, wooded area behind Simon's property, and connect to a commercial parcel currently under review for development. The firm had no legal right to submit on behalf of the board, which meant someone inside the neighborhood committee had either overstepped or falsified authorization. Greer was calm when he relayed the message. Simon listened in silence, absorbing the implications. This wasn't about bylaws or property values, it was land. Simple, old-fashioned, strategically positioned land. And Simon's garage sitting quietly at the back of his lot was in the way. Armed with this knowledge, Simon adjusted his posture. He wasn't just defending himself now, he was actively countering. The lawsuit became a shield rather than a burden, a pretext to force discovery, subpoena communications, and demand transparency in a way that no board was prepared for. He instructed Greer to prepare a secondary motion targeting the misuse of authority and unauthorized engagement with commercial third parties. At the same time, he submitted a formal request to the County Development Office to be notified of any filings that referenced parcels abutting his property line. He wasn't just responding, he was stepping directly into the path of the machine they had tried to build around him. While the legal pieces shifted into position, the social pressure in the neighborhood intensified. Simon's mailbox was now regularly filled with informational leaflets from various community committees, all written in the same cloying, condescending tone. Warnings about community values, encouragement to report non-conforming behaviors, and thinly veiled lectures on the responsibilities of collective living. He ignored them all, filed each one away, and instructed his new gardener to triple their hours and document every minute. He replaced the lighting around his property with fixtures approved by local ordinance and fitted with shielded housings to eliminate any claim of light pollution. Every hedge was trimmed, every boundary marked, every visible detail cross-referenced against the regulations. It was obsessive but necessary. There would be no crack in his defenses, no window for fabricated complaints. What they feared more than confrontation was a man who could operate by the book better than they ever could. Then came the unexpected breach. Simon returned home late one afternoon to find a woman standing in his driveway, clipboard in hand, snapping photographs of the side of his house. She wore no badge, no identifying apparel, and did not introduce herself. When he stepped out of the car and asked her purpose, she replied only that she was conducting an external property survey for administrative alignment. Simon asked her to leave immediately. She refused. He called the police, not as a threat, but as a documentation measure. When they arrived, she claimed she had been sent by the neighborhood board, though she could provide no formal documentation. The responding officer escorted her off the property but offered no real resolution. It was a message. They were escalating beyond letters and cameras. They were testing boundaries, literally. That evening, Greer prepared a cease and desist notice for trespass, paired with a demand for the identity and employment records of all contractors hired by the board in the last 60 days. The notice was hand-delivered and recorded. The message was clear. Every move would be tracked, every step measured, and every trespass countered with law. And then the middle cracked. The county notified Greer that a zoning petition had been filed, anonymously, but with coordinates that matched Simon's bordering land. It was a thin maneuver, an attempt to move the conversation toward potential public use language that could later justify eminent domain if the board could sway the right votes. But the filing itself was a fatal mistake, because now Simon and Greer could bring in external counsel with expertise in zoning law and challenged the validity of every action taken under the board's current leadership. It gave them jurisdictional leverage, new grounds to expand the case from a civil suit into a broader administrative dispute. What had begun as a parking complaint was now legally defined as a battle over land rights and misuse of authority. Simon stood on his porch that night, looking out into the dark, not with fear, but with a measured, grounded certainty. The game had shifted. His garage wasn't just a storage unit. It was a wall holding back the unchecked expansion of those who had forgotten that power was meant to serve, not consume. And as he sipped his drink, the wind quiet and sharp through the trees, he knew that Karen, sitting in her overfurnished living room with her mouth set in a hard, triumphant line, had no idea that she'd just crossed the point of no return. The weeks following the zoning petition were marked by a dangerous calm, the kind Simon Harding had learned to distrust during the most contentious legal conflicts of his career. It was the kind of silence that settled in just before an ambush. No announcements, no new letters, no anonymous flyers tucked under windshield wipers or wedged into mailboxes. The neighborhood was quiet, unusually so, and the absence of Karen's usual provocations did not offer relief. It signaled recalibration. Simon knew she hadn't backed off. She was preparing something larger, something with institutional teeth, and when it came, it landed like a hammer wrapped in velvet. It began with a summons, not from the court, but from the city's Department of Safety and Zoning. A formal investigation had been opened into his garage, citing suspected unauthorized structural modifications and potential code violations related to mechanical equipment storage in non-commercial zones. The complaint, though anonymous by policy, was clear in tone and purpose. Someone had submitted a request for inspection under the claim that the structure had been illegally converted into a workshop. The department was obligated to respond. Simon had anticipated something like this, but not the speed or scale of the maneuver. The inspector showed up with 2 assistants, all 3 wearing city-issued jackets and carrying tablets preloaded with documents. They weren't here for a courtesy visit. They had a mandate. Simon let them in. He had nothing to hide. The garage was clean, compliant, and built entirely within the boundaries of the permits filed at the time of construction. He presented every document, building permits, electrical certifications, contractor receipts, and allowed them to photograph the interior. But he saw it in their eyes, especially the lead inspector. They had expected a mess, some smoking gun that would validate the complaint and make their job simple. Instead, they found polished concrete floors, mounted storage units, and clearly labeled equipment. Nothing commercial, nothing unlawful. Just a man's private space maintained with care and precision. The lead inspector nodded slowly, reluctant but professional, and said, "You'll hear from our office within 10 business days." That, Simon knew, was the bureaucratic equivalent of admitting they had nothing. But the goal hadn't been to find violations, it had been to create tension. And in that, Karen had succeeded. Simon received another letter the following day, this time from the Neighborhood Board's Compliance and Standards Subcommittee, informing him that his property was now under formal review due to ongoing concerns regarding neighborhood harmony and safety. There was no explanation, no actionable request, just a statement, an insinuation that would linger on the record. He passed the letter to Greer, who read it twice, then simply said, "They're trying to brand you." Branding in legal warfare wasn't about truth. It was about creating an identity in the documentation, a phrase, a label, a reference point that future readers would accept as a baseline fact. Non-compliant resident. Pattern of dispute. Known subject of concern. Those labels stuck, especially when layered into multiple documents across separate departments. Karen wasn't just trying to beat Simon in court. She was trying to define him out of existence, using the very language of institutional bureaucracy to frame him as the anomaly, the nuisance, the problem. Simon pushed back. Greer escalated the complaint to the city's Internal Affairs Department, filing a grievance over misuse of municipal resources prompted by a private civil conflict. He included timelines, cross-reference submissions, and suggested that the coordination between Karen's board and the inspection request showed possible collusion. That word, collusion, wasn't used lightly. It came with weight, especially when paired with public funds. The city opened an inquiry. That didn't stop the campaign. It only shifted its angle. The next blow came not from the city, not from the board, but from Simon's professional world. A letter arrived, formal, discreet, and chilling in its implications. The Office of Judicial Oversight, an internal review body connected to the federal court system, had received an anonymous tip questioning Simon's temperament and community conduct. It cited escalating civil conflicts in his place of residence, noted his involvement in multiple legal disputes, and questioned whether such behavior reflected the standards expected of a senior clerk serving the Supreme Court. The letter didn't accuse him of misconduct. It didn't need to. It invited him to a private meeting to clarify context. Simon didn't panic, but for the first time in this conflict, he felt a sliver of cold fear, not for his property, not even for his privacy, but for the decades of professional integrity that had been built brick by brick. A reputation in the judiciary was not just earned, it was curated, protected, and constantly examined under the unforgiving light of institutional politics. He had made enemies in the past, but this was different. This was domestic sabotage. Karen, or someone working with her, had crossed into his life not just as a neighbor, but as an adversary willing to burn down his name to win a zoning dispute. He contacted Greer immediately, who in turn reached out to a former federal investigator now working in private consultancy. Within 72 hours, Simon had a timeline of digital activity, tracing the anonymous email to a local IP address tied to a third-party contractor who had appeared on the board's expenditure report 6 weeks earlier. It wasn't proof of Karen's direct involvement, but it was enough to introduce the specter of defamation into the courtroom if needed. Greer began drafting a motion to formally append a claim of reputational sabotage to their existing countersuit. Meanwhile, the pressure continued in the background. His insurance provider reopened its inquiry into his property status, citing newly submitted community documents. A tax assessor visited the neighborhood and left a note about a possible reevaluation of his parcel due to zoning ambiguity. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, but Simon didn't break. Instead, he documented each visit, each inspection, each bureaucratic intrusion, and handed it all to Greer, who was now assembling the materials not for defense, but for a public legal strike. The board meetings, once filled with snide commentary and procedural theater, began to thin out. A few residents stopped attending. Some had received letters from Greer's office warning of impending subpoenas for depositions. Others, perhaps sensing the shift in wind, simply chose silence over complicity. Karen remained defiant. She gave speeches about protecting neighborhood integrity and standing firm against targeted hostility. But behind the podium, her eyes flickered. She knew Simon wasn't fighting alone anymore. He wasn't isolated. He was building a case not just against her, but against the mechanism she had built around herself. And then, on a damp Wednesday morning, a white envelope arrived from the county clerk's office. It confirmed the registration of Simon's formal complaint for board misconduct and the court's approval of a motion to merge the civil suit with the zoning abuse investigation. For the first time, Karen and her board would be forced to sit in a deposition room, under oath, and answer questions not about motorcycles or mailboxes, but about finances, third-party contractors, and undeclared development interests. It was a crack in the dam, and Simon knew what would come next. Discovery, disclosure, exposure. That evening, he stood in his garage, the air filled with the subtle scent of oil and steel, and looked at the BMW parked beside the covered Vincent. He hadn't ridden in weeks. The conflict had consumed too much of his energy. But now something had shifted. He pulled the cover back, revealing the lines of a machine built not for display, but for movement. He didn't need to write it yet. Just seeing it reminded him of the reason he had never folded, never apologized for his presence. Some men collect power, others collect peace. But every man, when pushed, remembers the feeling of motion, of forward momentum, and Simon Harding was no longer sitting still. The deposition room was cold in a way that was intentional, a subtle tactic used in litigation spaces to keep everyone slightly on edge. No warmth, no comfort, no illusions of friendliness. Karen sat at the long oak table dressed in another of her trademark power suits. Her expression pulled tight with irritation, poorly masked as poise. Across from her, Greer reviewed his notes calmly while Simon sat still, neither gloating nor grim. This wasn't victory yet. It was confrontation under law, structured, recorded, with no room for games. The court reporter was already typing as Greer opened with the same deliberate pace that had unnerved judges and executives alike. He wasn't trying to catch Karen in some dramatic confession. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was cornering her with her own paperwork. The first hour was dry, procedural. Board bylaws, spending approvals, conflict of interest clauses. And Karen handled it with a combination of deflection and carefully memorized statements. But she didn't anticipate Greer's strategy. He wasn't chasing emotion. He was building a ledger of contradictions. He began producing expense reports, one after another, showing how her committee had authorized over $24,000 in consulting fees to a firm registered under her cousin's name. She tried to dismiss it as advisory overhead, but Greer slid a printed email onto the table. It showed her instructing the firm on how to phrase reports so they wouldn't trigger mandatory review by the community's finance committee. The air changed. Karen shifted in her chair. For the first time, she hesitated before answering. Then came the zoning petition, submitted weeks earlier, citing Simon's rear boundary as potential municipal right-of-way. Greer laid out the document side by side, the board's minutes showing no vote on the petition and the filed application, listing the association as the applicant. "Can you explain," Greer asked without raising his voice, "how this document bears your electronic signature if no meeting was held and no vote took place?" Karen faltered. She tried to pin the action on a clerical mistake, on an overzealous staffer, but it was too late. The signature had been confirmed by the city clerk. Greer leaned back. "So we're left with one of two possibilities. Either you falsified a community petition and submitted it to the county without authorization, or you allowed your digital credentials to be used in violation of public procedure. Which is it?" By the third hour, Karen was unraveling. She became defensive, then hostile, attacking the nature of the inquiry, the fairness of the process. Greer remained calm. Simon watched her with the same clinical detachment he had developed over years of preparing briefs for Supreme Court justices. She wasn't a strategist. She was a controller, and now that control had slipped. Every denial she made triggered another document, another name, another line item. When the session finally adjourned, she stormed out of the building without speaking a word to her attorney. Simon didn't celebrate. He knew the real fight was still ahead. The courtroom. But the balance had shifted. Word spread fast through the neighborhood. Within days, 2 other board members resigned without explanation. Anonymous messages appeared in Simon's inbox. Neighbors offering quiet support, even apologies. One woman confessed that Karen had pressured residents to submit complaints by threatening to increase their association dues. Another admitted that his initial complaint had been pre-written for him and handed over in a sealed envelope by a compliance assistant on Karen's payroll. The image of community outrage collapsed, revealing what Simon had suspected from the start. Most people had simply been afraid of becoming the next target. The civil court date was set for late autumn. Greer prepared a multi-pronged assault. Misuse of board authority, procedural fraud, targeted harassment, defamation, and financial malfeasance. The case drew attention from the County Oversight Committee, which initiated its own investigation into how the neighborhood board had operated without transparency for nearly a decade. But Simon remained focused. His goal wasn't spectacle. It was restoration. He didn't want headlines or pity. He wanted a ruling that closed the door to this kind of abuse. Not just for himself, but for anyone who dared to resist small-time tyrants in well-pressed suits. The day of the trial, the courtroom buzzed with quiet anticipation. Karen arrived with a different attorney, younger and less confident, the kind I hired in a panic. Her entourage had thinned. Even those who once whispered support kept their distance now. Simon entered alone, his presence composed but unmistakably firm. He brought no guests, no family, no allies in the gallery, just himself, his counsel, and the full weight of facts meticulously stacked like bricks. Testimony began with Greer laying out the timeline, methodically tracing each escalation from the initial fine over the parked motorcycle to the zoning petition aimed at removing Simon's property rights. He didn't dramatize, he didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. Each complaint, each board action, each procedural violation formed a mosaic of abuse dressed as governance. When Simon took the stand, he didn't play the victim. He spoke with measured clarity, explaining how each notice, each inspection, each bureaucratic intrusion was part of a deliberate strategy to force him into compliance or departure. He described the anonymous report to his Judicial Oversight Committee, how it threatened decades of service built on discretion and trust. He never raised his voice. He didn't need to. The turning point came when Greer introduced testimony from a former board secretary who had, after resigning, agreed to speak under oath. She described closed-door meetings where Karen gave instructions to fabricate complaints, to delay public disclosures, to push Simon until he caves or cracks. She even admitted that Karen referred to the zoning petition as a checkmate that would solve the motorcycle issue permanently. The court fell silent. Karen's attorney tried to suppress the statement as hearsay, but the judge allowed it, noting that the secretary's role and presence at the meetings gave the testimony credibility. Karen sat motionless, her eyes no longer scanning the room. She knew. When the verdict came, it didn't explode like a movie climax. It landed with the quiet finality of truth. The court found in Simon's favor on multiple counts: board misconduct, procedural abuse, and targeted harassment. Damages were awarded, but more importantly, the ruling mandated an independent audit of the neighborhood board, immediate suspension of current leadership, and an injunction preventing further actions against Simon or his property pending legal oversight. Simon didn't react. He thanked the judge, shook Greer's hand, and left the courtroom the same way he had entered, calm, upright, and silent. Outside, the sun cut through the clouds, warm against his skin. A few steps down the marble stairs, he paused. Not for the cameras, not for the symbolism, but because it was the first moment in nearly a year that he had nothing to anticipate, nothing to brace against. The war wasn't just over a motorcycle. It had never been. It was about principle, about refusing to be reshaped by fear or pressure. And now, with the law behind him and the path clear, Simon Harding could finally start walking forward without watching his back. The ruling didn't send shockwaves through the neighborhood the way some might have expected. There were no shouting matches, no protests, no spontaneous gatherings at the community clubhouse. What followed instead was a much quieter unraveling, a slow, steady withdrawal of support, a shift in posture, a sudden silence from those who once played along. Karen's name was removed from all official listings within a week. The board was placed under state-supervised audit. The consulting firm she had funneled money through issued a formal statement denying knowledge of the zoning misuse, effectively severing ties with her, and shielding itself from further investigation. No one defended her publicly. Those who had once backed her efforts began quietly distancing themselves, citing misunderstandings or complete ignorance. Her power dissolved not in flames but in neglect. That was always how real control ended. When the fear disappeared and people stopped pretending, Simon didn't gloat. He didn't attend the post-verdict meetings where restructuring plans were discussed, nor did he participate in the neighborhood's attempts to rebrand itself under new leadership with transparency. He had no interest in redemption arcs or image, rehabilitation campaigns. His focus returned to the simple things: his home, his work, and his motorcycles. The Vincent remained in its usual place, pristine beneath its canvas cover, but the BMW came out again on Saturday mornings, the low hum of its engine echoing down the street as he rode past the same homes where curtains used to twitch with suspicion. Now, if people watched, they did so quietly, some with guilt, others with quiet respect. No one waved, and Simon didn't expect them to. He wasn't a hero. He had simply refused to bow. A month after the ruling, Simon received a formal letter from the Judicial Oversight Committee. It confirmed that no further review would be conducted, that the complaint filed against him had been deemed baseless, and that his standing remained untarnished. The letter was polite, even encouraging, but Simon understood the subtext. The system had taken the accusation seriously, and it would remember that it had once been fooled. Trust, once questioned, never fully returns. But for Simon, that was fine. His reputation had not been built on charm or popularity. It had been built on precision, discretion, and resolve. He would continue his work as he always had, quietly, effectively, with nothing on his record but excellence. As the board audit unfolded, a series of reforms were implemented. Term limits were introduced. Financial transparency measures were passed. Residents were granted access to meeting transcripts and expenditure logs. The association bylaws were rewritten with clearer language and stricter enforcement safeguards. Ironically, the very structure that had once been used to corner and control was now reshaped by the precedent Simon had set. People no longer whispered about resistance in corners. They had rules to protect them now. He didn't attend the vote that passed those changes. He didn't need to. His signature, printed at the top of the original complaint, had already done the work. Karen, for her part, disappeared from view. She sold her house in the early winter under a private listing and moved out without ceremony. A moving truck arrived one Thursday morning and was gone by evening. No farewell note, no neighbors gathered to see her off. Just silence. Some speculated about lawsuits, about liens, about quiet settlements to avoid further legal exposure. Simon didn't ask. He didn't need vengeance, he needed distance. Her absence was its own closure. Spring came late that year, and when it did, Simon found himself standing at the edge of his property, near the line where the woods met his rear fence. The same place Karen had once tried to convert into a paved access road. Now, the trees stood untouched, their branches thick with new growth. The zoning petition had been withdrawn, and the developer had quietly canceled interest in the parcel. Nature had reclaimed its quiet, and so had Simon. On a Sunday morning, well after sunrise, Simon pulled the Vincent out of the garage. He polished it not because it needed it, but because he always had. Rituals mattered. They reminded him who he was. He kick-started the engine and let it rumble to life, the sound smooth and deep, the machine purring like it had waited patiently all winter. He didn't ride far, just out of the driveway, down the street, and through the long, winding road that bordered the neighborhood before it merged with the highway. He didn't race. He cruised. There was no destination, just movement, just the road. At a red light, a man in a pickup rolled down his window and nodded. "Nice bike," he said, voice flat but genuine. Simon nodded back. "Thanks." The light turned green. They moved on. That was enough. There was no need to retell the story, no need to warn or recount or relive. The record existed. The lesson had been taught, and in its place, Simon had earned something quieter, more valuable than vindication. He had earned stillness, the kind of peace that doesn't come from being left alone, but from being left standing,